Director for the House Republican Caucus, and welcome to our Senate and House Republican media availability. And thank you for joining us. Republican Caucus Chair Ann Rivers and Senate Republican Floor Leader Shelley Wilcox, House Republican Assistant Floor Leader Drew McEwen. After opening remarks from Senator Braun and Representative Wilcox, we will open it up and then we will allow you to also follow up with questions. Senator Braun for some opening remarks.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. This is, of course, our first chance to discuss things really as a group after November's election and our reorganization. So I look forward to lots of interesting questions as we get ready for finally a legislative session after 10 months of asking the governor or the majorities to work with us on a special session to address the many challenges our state has had over the last year. There's little choice now. There's going to be a regular session in January, regardless of what the governor wants. And I hope we have the opportunity to talk about public health issues to start with, but also issues with our budget, with our economy, how we get our children safely back into schools, and maybe even think about some emergency powers reform with the majorities in the two chambers. So lots to work on over the next several months. We have, some concerns about how we do this, both safely through the legislative session, but also transparently and openly, so the public, the press, stakeholders across these issues have a chance to weigh in a meaningful way. So again, lots to talk about. Thank you again for being here, and I will turn it over to Representative Wilcox to provide his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I'd like to take a moment first to say I'm glad to see all of you. It's been a long time, and I cannot tell you how frustrating it has been this year for all of us in the legislature to be dealing with election year restrictions. That means that it's much more difficult to communicate with the press at the same time as other branches of government don't have the same restrictions. And I think that this year in particular, that was not really great for you, for us, or for the public, which is most important. The other thing that I want to do is recognize the great choices that I think the Senate Republicans made. I'm so happy to see John Braun in that position. John and I have been friends since I think the day that he was elected. We have a lot in common. I think people in every single chamber and throughout that building recognize that he is probably the most creative thinker in Olympia, the most driven to provide solutions, and the one who I think has been extremely successful in having his ideas incorporated into legislation, whether he's been in the majority or the minority. And I also want to recognize Senator Sessler, 28 years of service. I think I met him when he was a Cub representative because I built a processing plant in his district in the late 90s. And Senator Sessler, who was Representative Sessler then, and just a kid, came and honored us with his presence. And we've stayed in touch ever since then. One thing that people don't know about Mark is that he is really, really good at staying in touch. And I appreciated his very frequent calls. He was much better at staying in touch with me than I was in staying in touch with him. And that's an important thing in government. We should all be talking across the aisles and across the chambers. So that was just a few personal notes that I wanted to share. I want to echo Senator Braun's words about a special session. You all have heard me and others in both of our caucuses asking for special sessions since the very beginning of the interim because of the crazy circumstances of COVID and the overwhelming impact on our constituents clear across the state that our reaction to COVID has created. I've said many times that if I was the governor, I think I would want more people involved in this because the things that are required now require buy-in from all parties. And when you don't have participation, it is much, much harder to have buy-in. And I think we're seeing consequences of that across the state as well. We've still got some time to do this. I think every single state in the Western Alliance that the governor helped create has had at least one special session. Many of them have had multiple special sessions. And it's, I think, unfortunate that while he joined them in many cases in taking common action, in this case, he didn't. We also, I think, are going to be interested in talking about the challenges at employment security. Seattle Times, I thought, had a pretty hard-hitting editorial recently. Both John and I and others on this call have been involved in management in enterprises that are not small. And we're used to situations where people make mistakes. These were pretty devastating mistakes across the state. But what makes those even worse is when you find situations where there's apparent resistance on the part of management to taking the steps that will help find solutions, especially when it is a state government agency that disperses billions of dollars and the public has the right to have scrutiny in that agency. And I know some of my members will have more to add to that. So again, good to see all of you and looking forward to questions.
Hey, let's start with Rachel LaCour from the Associated Press.
For both leaders, what specific bills are your members working on related to the state budget and economic recovery? And have you talked with Democratic leadership about those measures ahead of session?
John, I'm deferring to the Senate here.
Sounds good. I think there's a lot of bills, and I'm not going to go through the laundry list. We'd be happy to provide that afterwards. But I think the key things, of course, we're going to have discussions about how or even if we use the rainy day fund. Right now, it looks like the budget will balance through the next 4.5 years, largely without the rainy day fund. So, do we need to use it, or should we, save it in case it gets worse? Because it certainly could. Or can we use it for specific COVID-related expenses, either for public health or possibly to keep our economy, moving along well? So I expect that to happen. I expect lots of discussion about how we deal with the unemployment trust fund. And as JT mentioned, we've created quite a challenge there. Some of it was necessary to respond to the high unemployment in the spring and summer. Some of it was just mismanagement, but regardless, this places a huge new tax burden on our businesses and organizations around the state. Over $1 billion expected in new taxes next year, and another additional $1 billion beyond that the year after. So that's a big hit in to come right after the economic impacts of the pandemic. So I expect those to be on the table. I guess it's not necessarily budget related, which is what I think what you asked. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work with the majorities in both chambers on emergency powers reform and get a system that's a little more balanced, that takes in perspectives from around Washington to make sure we're all in this together. We're not just isolated pockets, dictating to the rest of the state.
I'd add in there, I've got a series of proposals that are being drafted. A couple of them are ready, and they all deal with being able for businesses to put off whether it's their business license renewals or their tax obligations into the second quarter of 2021, still keeping it in our current fiscal year to minimize the impact of the operating budget. But hopefully giving a bit of a lifeline to those businesses to be able to weather this storm. I mean, my God, you barely make it through 2020. And lo and behold, here at the end of the year, you got to be shut down for another 4 weeks. And oh, by the way, your unemployment insurance could go up 300 to 700%. Those are real serious issues. And I think we got to do everything we can to help the bottom line for businesses. And I think we can do a lot of that and minimize the impact of the operating budget.
Yeah, in a broader sense, I would say that House Republicans, right at the top of every member's list is how do we go about first mitigating and then restoring what has happened to especially our small business economy and all of the families that depend on that. And I'm not talking about just people that own small businesses, but the staff members and employees who often have poured their lives into this part of the economy in the same way that owners do. One of the, I think, real tragedies that is tearing us apart right now is the burden of COVID and the reaction to COVID is spread so unevenly. We know that there are certain populations where infection rates and mortality rates are much, much higher. We absolutely have to be concerned about how do we mitigate that? How do we make up for that? And when you come to the economy again, there are many people that are not feeling it in their pocketbook. And in many cases, the whole burden is falling on a narrow part of the economy. And it's hard for people to recognize that if they're not part of that small business economy. And our members want to use the budget and the budget process in every case to see if we can repair some of that damage.
Rachel, did you have a follow-up question?
I know we have a lot of people on the call and not a lot of time, so I'll cede my second question to my colleagues.
Austin Jenkins from Northwest News Network.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Hello, hello.
Yes.
Yep.
I am curious about the issue of police reform, which I know is a top priority of the governor and majority Democrats. And I'm wondering to what extent Republicans have been a part of the discussions. I know Roger Goodman's committee in the House had a work session on this earlier in the week, and also just sort of what your caucus's interest and appetite is around this issue.
Well, I deferred to the Senate last time, so I'll take it on first. In our caucus, we have people that are deeply committed to this as well. And maybe sometimes we have different perspectives. I really want to get Representative Alex Ibarra involved in this. He may have a different perspective than many of us do. As all of you know, we've had a lot of law enforcement over time in our caucus. And so the perspective of Brad Clifford, who's been our caucus lead for a long time on this, is important. And so is the perspective of Eric Roberts, who has been an active policeman. He's been a U.S. Marshal and deeply involved in these kinds of issues for many years as well. I think we all recognize that we've got problems that we've got to solve. And actually, Washington was, several years ahead of this because of 940 and then the really positive cooperation that took place in the bill that fixed some of the challenges in 940. And I hope that when you think about that, you'll think about the speeches that were made, especially by Brad Clifford, talking about how important that was. We'd like to have the same spirit here. And I also want to recognize one other group that I think is interested in this in kind of a unique way, that wants to be part of the process. I think in a very balanced way is the Indian tribes in the state of Washington as well. And I've been talking with them about their interest here.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think JT covered most of the things. I would just add, I think there are a lot of things in the coming session. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work in a bipartisan basis. This is one where I have some concern, frankly. We've, at least in the Senate, have largely been excluded from the discussions by the majority and by the governor's office. And we've had an ongoing group, literally since the early last summer, within our caucus that's met and talked not only to concerned citizens, but also to law enforcement to get their thoughts. And they have very, very good thoughts. So our experience so far is that they're very open to reasonable reform, but we want to make sure we not only make them more effective, but we don't create, safety issues around our state. So this needs a balanced perspective, and I hope we'll get a balanced dialogue in the coming session. But based on the actions of the governor's office and the majority so far, I have some, I think, legitimate concerns about that.
Did you have a follow-up, Austin?
I'll take Rachel's cue and let others jump in.
Okay. Next, we have Essex Porter of Cairo TV.
Yes, hello. Could leaders from each of the groups talk more specifically about the COVID relief that you would like to provide? And I was interested to hear that apparently there will not be a need to tap the rainy day fund, and wanted to be sure I heard that correctly, but especially focused on COVID relief.
Well, I think nobody has been more explicit in agenda for action than Representative McEwen. So maybe Drew can provide some more detail.
Yeah, I think the as I mentioned before, suspending B&O tax collections until the second quarter, and then providing that the 3 months of the second quarter be able to pay that without penalty or interest. Giving a COVID B&O tax credit against your liability that as a result of the various orders that have happened over the past several months. So having up to a $5,000 credit against any B&O tax liability that would have a significant impact to a number of businesses. And again, the unemployment insurance is a huge issue. Again, estimates are 300 to 700% increases there on premiums. That'll be a killer to just about any size business. We've got to address that. And then business licenses, whether it's liquor or your regular license, being able to postpone those renewal fees until May of 21 to again allow a little bit of time. But we, in all of this, it sounds employer centric, and it's really not. This is about being able to preserve the business and being able to preserve subsequently the employees that you still have. And if we don't take some serious action here, we're going to continue to see massive unemployment claims going up. We have a completely inept ESD department, and that's blocking an audit from a fellow elected or from an elected auditor statewide. And she's expressed grave concerns about ESD's willingness to cooperate in that audit, and that raises even more questions. So I think that's one of the big areas that we really got to get under control and make sure that we've got the safety net there that's needed when people are unemployed. And I'm very concerned about that issue. That has a direct impact on employees and employers. So we've got to really be looking at that. We've also got to be probably looking at property tax relief. We've seen massive increases across the state, and those bills come due again this coming April. And that affects everybody across the board. So that's another area that we've really got to have a lot of focus on as well.
To follow up, is there any direct relief to individuals that's being contemplated? Perhaps it is rental assistance, perhaps it is something else, but any direct relief to individuals that are hurting?
Well, again, I would address from the front on evictions, et cetera, has had a large impact. But that proposal, we're not like the federal government. We don't have the ability to print constituents. But again, we can take measured relief that does businesses. And we've also got to look at things from a mental health standpoint, too. I mean, massive unemployment, this has had serious domestic impacts. I'm willing to look at any proposal that's out there. But I think, again, you can't do. But one of the biggest impacts we could have would be on the property tax side.
Go ahead, JT.
I was going to say we should give the Senate a chance.
Well, Essex, there are so many things that are impacting, individuals and families. And I've heard from so many people where, a double income family has had to reduce income, so one's working and one's staying home taking care of the kids. And when you look at the interruption to education and you look at the interruption to childcare, we have lost tremendous numbers of childcare facilities, both in-home daycares and facility daycares. And what you're really doing is you're having a huge economic impact on that ability of that family to provide for themselves. And so there are a lot of things I think that we can do and should do to really help the family, individuals and families rebound. I just remind you that we heard in our Economic Special Recovery Task Force that we are the 5th worst state in the union when it comes to, company losses, to business losses in the state of Washington. So I think anything we can do to help recover those small businesses helps people recover their jobs and their livelihoods. I was talking to a family just the other day where she works at a restaurant and it's just not making sense for them to stay open with the new restrictions. And so, she's going to lose her job for a time. And while she knows she has a job to come back to, we're talking right in the middle of the holiday season. She has young children. She's trying to keep her head up and keep her spirits up for her kids, but it's tough. It's tough on families. We want to do things safely. Absolutely. The coronavirus is nothing to shake a stick at. It's very serious for certain people. But we just can't keep doing this broad brush. And so I think you're going to see many different proposals to help families this session.
And Essex, Senator Rivers, I would like to chime in based on some. So we have a situation where landlords are actually singular home ownership. What that means is that's less in life or someone who's on the downward slope. It's going to last for some time. Rental housing market is shrinking at a time when we do property tax landlords who have seen maybe 50% or more exemption. We're now 9 months or a month in rent, and you've paid nothing. You now have to, that's all being right now absorbed by the landlord's plan was to have the rents for retirement. So the bow wave of our activities will.
Let's move on to the next question. Sarah Gensler of McClatchy. Is Sarah there?
Oh, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, sorry about that. This is for both leaders. Senator Braun mentioned reform of emergency powers a couple times now. Can you please get more specific about what changes you'd like to introduce, and then maybe go into what kind of reception those ideas have gotten or you expect them to get from your counterparts in the majority?
Yeah, sure. And actually, if I may, just before I do that, I want to answer part of Essex questions because I don't think anybody did about the use of the rainy day fund. And I brought that up earlier. If you look at the 4-year balance as produced by the by nonpartisan staff in the House and the Senate and OFM, you go out and you look at the balance 4.5 years from now, at the end of the next 2 bienniums, it's a negative $422 million. And why that? So just to be clear, that's essentially balanced. That's in over 5 years, we're going to spend $130 billion and we're going to be down by $422 million. That's like a short afternoon for appropriations and Ways and Means bipartisan staff to work that out. So for all practical purposes, we are balanced, and that is without using the rainy day fund. Back to Sarah's question, which now that I've spoken, I've kind of forgotten the question, but let me think for a second. Sarah, can you say that question again? Because I'm embarrassed to say I talked myself out of it.
No problem. So you had mentioned reform of emergency powers, and I'd like just to get more specific on that, and then what sort of reception ideas have gotten in the majorities.
So I would thank you. I would highlight 2 main ideas. One is this notion that the governor gets to reintroduce, proclamations, forever, and we do have some basic ability to say no, but it really doesn't allow for much dialogue and discussion about is that the right way or is there a better way, and it hasn't worked very well. So there's a pretty good proposal out there, which I think has gotten pretty good reception across the aisle, to say, look, the governor can do that for 30 days, but after 30 days, we need to have a special session to work this out. So I think that's kind of the basis for a lot of it. And then the other big one I would highlight is the unanticipated receipts process. And this year, it's a section of law that basically allows the governor through OFM to appropriate money, and I'll remind everybody that within the Constitution, but it allows the governor to the executive branch to appropriate funds received, unexpected funds received. So, and historically that's been like you got a $500,000 grant from the Department of the Interior to do something or something along those lines. Very small numbers, maybe a couple $1 million. It never anticipated nearly $3 billion in unanticipated receipts. So over the last year, the governor has essentially, in single person rule, has appropriated all the funds that have come in through the stimulus funds. Nobody anticipated the law working that way. So I know there's a lot of effort trying to come back and say, let's figure out a better way to do this that involves the legislature in a more significant way and make sure that we appropriate those representation from around the state. We are a representative government in the appropriation that has received some significant interest on the other side of the aisle. Now, we have a long ways to go, but I am hopeful we'll be able to figure out something that and this isn't, I don't mean this as a poke at the governor. The governor is operating within the current law. We need to find a way that incorporates all branches of government, or at least the legislative and the executive, in a better way. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, and in the House, Representative Walsh has been working on legislation for several months, and it has the same basic idea. If a state of emergency is going to be continued past a certain date or longevity, then the legislature should be a session of the legislature, and the legislature should be involved in decisions regarding whether or not we're going to have a state of emergency that doesn't really have a clear end. And I think the original laws regarding state of emergency are flawed. There's no definition of how long an emergency lasts. And we should fix that. And I've seen dissatisfaction with the current scenario on the part of any collaboration and is not dead. So that's one of the things that we can get done. And I will also say this doesn't mean that you deny that there's an emergency. There's been an emergency. But it says that, all four chambers have to come in and vote on it and maybe vote on some of the other provisions that the governor thinks are right. He will get more buy-in when he does that. In this case, he has comfortable control. His party has comfortable control of both chambers. So it's not going to be a coup. It would simply be the three branches of government working together as everyone who's an American expects them to do.
Did you have a follow-up, Sarah?
Just a quick yes or no. Is this directly tied to the fact that the governor did not call a special session? These reforms?
Well, I don't think you could come to any other conclusion that it has something to do with the lack of special session over the last 10 months. We're one of the few states in the entire country that hasn't been in session. But it's also just the proclamation process, how it works, just unwieldy. It doesn't allow for an effective, expression of viewpoints from around the state. So sure, it involves the lack of a special session. I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone, but I think it's probably a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, I'd say that we've had an unexpected opportunity test. I think that there's flaws. I don't think it's partisan to want to fix those.
Next up, we have Keith Eldridge of Como TV.
Hi, good morning, and good to see you all. Still sheltering at home after almost 9 months, and looking forward to my 32nd session. The question goes along those lines of December 14th, the restrictions are set to end. I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like you to state it. Do you think the restrictions should be continued as well?
I think on the House side, I'll defer to Representative Mossbrucker. She was unexpectedly crushed again as a result of some of these, but also the economy. So Gina, why don't you go ahead and take this answer for us?
Thank you for the question. I think that what we've seen across the state is that businesses can open safely as pandemic, and we're learning every single day. But we see business tracking the numbers that other areas are, and by closing these businesses, and it's devastating not only to employers, but it's devastating to the owner. And we're worried that these families don't have money. I believe in COVID 100%. I have colleagues and friends that have COVID businesses alive and open, and giving them lifelines that are sufficient to try to get these funds back into businesses. But if you look across, more than we've ever seen, and these were someone's dream, financing, the ability to care for their families, and we pay in, which are a lot. And as Representative McEwen stated, and our taxes on business is absolutely, it's just not, even if the business is open, we're seeing such a low customer base. We have to, if we're going to close businesses, we have to have lifelines. And we have to use the tools that are successful currently in order to special session. That's frustrating because we're asking frontline go to work, but yet we can't go to work. We're elected by people to be there and to do the job. There's ways to do it properly and safely, and choice.
And so are you in favor of reopening indoor dining and restaurants and allowing the fitness centers and bowling alleys to reopen, since those industries tell me that there have been no showing of COVID in those settings?
I think if science, if that's what we're following, shows that's true, And it has. We've seen restaurants not contract. You look at the numbers, and it's not one of the highest places in many cases and many studies that show if restaurants are doing it properly and safely, just like schools are. New York just sent 30,000 students back to class because they felt like it was almost safer in a classroom. The kids are washing their hands, they're social distancing. The teachers are doing an amazing job of keeping students safe. It's safer than if they're home and they're playing with the neighborhood kids. And we're social by nature. You know, we like to be around people. We figured out how to do that safely. And as long as we follow the rules and regulations, I think the minimal capacity, if we have to do it, at least gives us some revenue and the ability to someday open again fully. So I do think that there's a safe way to do it without losing the entire economy, which again, those funds that we pay run the government, right? We're putting money into those coffers in order to keep the government working. And without those funds or a stimulus package from the House and Senate congressionally, it is a dark winter. We keep hearing dark winter, and it's very concerning.
I would just like to jump in. I mean, your question about whether we should open on the 14th, that's a good question. I don't question the governor's, operating in good faith to try to solve a legitimately hard problem in the surge and make sure we don't get out of control. What I think we need is a more balanced discussion and a more selective effort, right now, and basically follow the data we have. The data we have, and you can question whether it's the best data. Okay, it's our state governments that's come up with it by and large. The data says, restaurants aren't the major cause, but maybe they are the major cause in certain parts of the state and not in other parts of the state. Let's let data and science drive it, and more fundamentally, let's trust the citizens of the state of Washington. Let's trust, restaurant owners to care about their employees and their customers, and let's trust, citizens to make good decisions about whether to go out to eat this evening or not, as I believe they will. And that doesn't mean they'll be perfect, but we're far from perfect right now. We are crushing a big chunk of our economy, of people's livelihoods, the way they care for their family, and it's just not right. We need, and the other part of being balanced is recognize there are more than just public health issues here from the pandemic. There are also mental health issues. There's, Representative Mosberger mentioned schools. There's long-term academic, social, emotional issues. We keep having a single focused discussion about the pandemic and not bringing into account all the other risks that go along with our actions. And I would just like to see, doesn't mean we should do nothing. It just means we need to have a more balanced approach, both representatively, bringing voices around the state and recognizing the impacts aren't the same everywhere. And finally, recognizing that there are other risks besides just the pandemic if we take these actions.
Okay, next we will go to Hannah Scott of Cairo Radio. Are you there, Hannah? Okay, we'll come back to Hannah if we can. Next up would be Drew Mickelson of King TV.
Good morning. Question for the two leaders. This week, I've been speaking with business owners who are ignoring the governor's order. One owns a gym in Graham, and then we talked to a couple of restaurant owners along I-5, Spiffy's for one. The state says it's taking legal action against these folks. Should the state be cracking down on business owners who defy the rule, or should the state back off and let this play out?
Well, I think, I've been saying it since the beginning. I think various spokesmen around the state did a good job of helping to educate people about the fact that the majority of the spread was taking place in small private gatherings. And it was a total shock when all of a sudden, over the course of a weekend, actually, the switch was made to close down most of the operations in the areas that you mentioned. So there is a huge lack of explanation, and that creates a lack of buy-in. My heart is with it, with all these businesses, and the consequences are large. I've said before, none of us here have to pay those fines. So I'm not going to tell people what to do. Business people need to make their own decisions. They're the ones that are going to have to pay the consequences. I think that actually what we have right now is an opportunity for the governor to do a de-escalation job. For the last year, we have seen governments all over the state do selective enforcement, deciding when they're going to enforce, and then in example after example, deciding that they're not going to enforce things that has resulted in injury and death to people and massive damage to property. So nobody right now has the moral high ground when it comes to enforcing things. This is an opportunity for a good discussion, and we should all take that.
Yeah, I can't say that any better. I think JT did a nice job. This is complex. There are real consequences on all sides, and as I said earlier, it deserves a balanced discussion. And I think, you know, the governor, if he wants to reclaim some of the moral authority I think he has given up by his selective enforcement, he would be wise to find a way to de-escalate, find a way to work on specific problems in specific areas, and stop using these broad brush approaches. And again, an enforcement approach instead of a encouragement approach, and trust people to do the right thing. Fundamentally, I believe our caucuses trust the citizens of the state of Washington to behave well. And I'll certainly concede that doesn't mean it will happen 100% of the time. I really believe it will happen most of the time, and more times than it's happening right now with this coercive approach.
Hey, Drew, can I also COVID experience? I don't know if everyone can see his picture, but it's funny.
Yeah, I forget to turn off the picture sometimes when I'm talking.
Well, you look a lot better now.
Okay. Thank you both for your time. And just to clarify, the comparison you're making is to what happened this summer with the CHOP zone. And just so I'm clear, that's the reference you were making, Representative Wilcox.
Oh, I think that's probably the most obvious example, but there's been example after example, even in Olympia, where there's been times when people have just been allowed to destroy things with no consequences. And respect for the law should be something that is universally enforced. And when you don't do that, then your ability to enforce, I think, is badly diminished.
Okay, I did hear from Hannah Scott, who said that she would not be able to ask a question. So we do have time for one more question, and it actually came in beforehand from Nick Scott of Bicoastal Media. And that question is there an effort, and if so, bipartisan legislative support, to amend the governor's current health emergency powers or orders and proclamation? If not, what's the plan? And this will be our last question for the event.
I think we've kind of answered that question, if I understand it right. You're talking about how, a reform of the emergency powers. We had a pretty good discussion on that. There are proposals out there, certainly in the two Republican caucuses, with interest, I think, that I know of in both the majority caucuses, to limiting the length of proclamations before a special session is called. There's a lot of discussion in the budget world about improving how we appropriate unanticipated receipts, such as the stimulus funding we've received over the last 10 months. So yes, absolutely. There's efforts to look at this and make it better. Again, to use the comment from Representative Wilcox, a lot of good lessons learned over the last 10 months, and that's not a partisan thing. It just means we know more. We should use that experience to make our process better.
In closing, Representative Wilcox, do you have any comments?
No, it's good to see all of you.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being with us today. Hope to have another event here this month, and we'll be sending that information out to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.